Burson Soloist Voyager is about $591 more than the equivalently spec'd Soloist 3X or 3GT. So that leads to the question of whether there's any reason to buy the Voyager over the Soloist 3X GT or 3GT, and I'll explain that in just a second. And is there anything that's been done inside within the circuit of the Voyager that actually makes it that much of a better headphone amp, or is it just that they've changed the cooling and the fan and therefore the case setup? I've compared the Voyager with the 3X GT and a bunch of different op amps to see just how close I can get the two of them to match. Of course, I've also compared the Voyager to some other premium headphone amps, such as the recently reviewed Schiit Mjolnir 3 and also the very excellent Enleum AMP-23R, so I can hopefully give you a sense of if this is truly a top-of-the-line endgame headphone amp, or if it's falling a little bit short of the top of the tree. Before I dive into this review, I just want to let you know I'm a little bit under the weather, so hopefully this is still going to be up to my normal standard. Apologies if I'm not quite as sharp as usual. And to get things rolling, we're going to have a really quick look at some basic specs for the Voyager, then dive into sound quality and some comparisons, and then I'll come back around at the end and talk a bit more in detail about the design, the new approach with the Voyager compared to the Soloist 3X GT, all those kinds of details, specs, features, benefits, etc., the things I like and I don't like. And so the Voyager comes in at $4,199 and that's if you buy it with the V7 op amps. So the V7 op amps are the brand new range from Burson. I've reviewed them separately just recently here on the channel. I'll put a link so you can go and check that one out. I'll either put it as a card here in the video or in a link down below in the description. So check that one out if you want to know more about the op amps themselves, and I'll come back around and talk a bit more about them later. But you can buy the Voyager for $4,199 with the V7 op amps, or you can spend a bit less and get it with the V6 op amps. Now just to be really clear, the V7 op amps are a clear and obvious upgrade over the V6, and therefore I think it's worth thinking about this amplifier at its maximum state with the V7s, so that's how I've tested it. The Voyager will put out 8 watts into a 32 ohm load, and I'm also putting on screen right now the other power output levels at different impedances. But the key thing is it's got buckets and buckets of power for any headphone you're likely to drive with it. And then finally, just as the Soloist GT models have had, it's got things like balance control, crossfeed, auto power off, a remote control, and it's a new remote control with the Voyager that I kind of like. But that's the gist of it and the basics. As I said, I'll go into more detail at the end, but that's what you need to know to get us up and running. So it's a $4,200 headphone amp and preamp, with some nice features, lots of power, and lots of different inputs and outputs. And so with that in mind, let's dive in now and talk about how it sounds. For all my testing in this video, I've been running my PC as the transport, outputting via my JCAT USB card through a tubulous Consensus USB cable, and feeding that into the Chord M scaler onto the TT2, and then from the TT2 out to the Voyager or the Soloist GT or the Enleum, etc., always via Curious XLR or Curious RCA cables. Listing was done mostly with the Meza Elites and the Focal Utopias, but I've tried a bunch of other headphones as well. As I said before, there's no issue with headphone pairing with this amplifier because it's got buckets and buckets of power. And as a little side note, it's also theoretically better at handling all different sorts of headphone loads, and particularly headphones with variable impedance curves. But we'll come back around and talk about that at the very end. Firing up the Voyager for the first time, what you can expect to hear is a very mature, refined, and detailed sounding amplifier. I talked about a lot of this when I did the first look live stream about the Voyager back before it was officially released, and the model that I had then was a pre-production. I can't compare it directly with this final production version of the Voyager, but from what Burson have told me, they've made a few updates in the firmware and little tweaks and bits and pieces so that the production versions are even better than what I heard in the pre-production. And that might be true. All I know is that when I plugged this in, powered it up, this being the production version, it was absolutely impressive. And that's probably the easiest way that I can describe the sound from the Voyager is impressive. Not impressive in the sense that it's got party tricks that are going to draw your attention to certain things that might eventually get a bit old and a bit fatiguing, but impressive in the sense that it is just so under control, so refined, so detailed, and so effortless. It's a very impressive amp. One of the biggest features of the sound from the Voyager for me is the sense of separation and size in the soundstage. And that's partly down to the new V7 op amps, but it's also down to the actual design of the amplifier itself. And the reason I'm saying that will become much clearer when I talk about the Soloist GT comparison. What you get as you listen to the Voyager is a very, very lifelike sound. To me, when you start getting into the world of really fantastic headphone amps, It's hard to say which one is truly correct, but what matters most is which ones sound the most like you're in the room with the musician. Which ones get out of the way, disappear, and allow you just to enjoy the music, and to my ears, the Voyager is right up there amongst the very best I've heard. In other words, it's up there alongside, and I'm not saying it's exactly the same or technically as good as some of these, but in terms of the overall sense of transparency and naturality of these amps, it's up there for me with things like the HM1, the Zale HM1, the Enleum AMP-23R, and now the Voyager's in there as well. And so those are the sorts of amps that this is playing alongside and doing it very comfortably. As I said, I'm not saying it's technically the same as, say, an HM1. I think the HM1 would win on things like resolution, but the Voyager, in terms of its overall quality of sound, its quality of presentation, and its ability to get out of the way, that's where it's up there on the same level. And I'll talk more about the comparison to the Enleum when we get around to the comparisons. Something else that I really like about the Voyager's sound is it has this wonderful sense of bass control, bass power, bass punch. It never seems to enhance anything in terms of the frequency response, but it's got this undeniable sense of control and authority when it comes to bass notes. At the other end of the scale, the treble is extended, it's detailed, but it's also very refined. The Voyager is an amp that will absolutely show you if there's sibilance in a recording, but it won't punish you with it. And it also won't create sibilance where there isn't sibilance. It's a very refined sound, as I said before, very mature. In the middle of all that is a mid-range that's just natural. It has a good sense of weight, a good sense of character and texture, and so I think this is a bit of a culmination of an evolution, if you like, from the Soloist GT range, where these have gradually gone from having a very slightly unnatural timbre at times to getting better and better as we went through the 2023 version of the GT and then into the 2023 upgraded version with the Silent Power O2 modules. And now I think the Voyager has kind of reached a pinnacle of that transition, and that is that it's now got a tonality that I think is spot on across the board. And in fact, as I listened to it and I thought more and more about it, the sound from the current Voyager range reminds me of if you go back to the previous older style, you know, the silver blocky style Soloist of the past. I can't remember the name off the top of my head, the model kind of variant name, but the older original silver Burson amplifiers that were quite square and long. Those amplifiers had the same kind of character to their sound, a slightly weighty, smooth, very enjoyable sound that didn't have that V-shapedness that the 3XP and the GT's got into a little bit. The Voyager for me now is a bit of a return to that old sound, but with much, much, much higher quality. So tonality-wise, I'm saying it's closer to that. It's probably less rich and warm as some of those amps were, and the detail, the transparency, the staging and the space is all turned up significantly. So don't for a second think I'm saying this is only as good as some of those older amps that were much lower in price. This is a true premium amplifier that performs accordingly, but it's got that lovely sense of weight and authority behind it that I think sometimes the GTs could be missing just ever so slightly. And now, to be clear, this is not me saying that all of a sudden the GTs are a bad amp. The GT is still one of my absolute favourite headphone amplifiers on the market. Until the Voyager arrived here recently, the Soloist 3X GT with the SPO2 modules in it was my go-to amp when I needed anything for testing and switching back and forth because it's one of the best out there. I do also rank the HEADPHONE Prelude and of course the Enleum AMP-23R in terms of headphone amps that I go to in my collection. And so I don't want this to sound like all of a sudden the Soloist GT is junk. It's definitely not. It's a wonderful, wonderful headphone amp, but Burson have gone one step up again with the Voyager. And so to put all that further into context, let's talk a bit now about the Voyager up against some other headphone amps. And I want to start off by briefly talking about the Schiit Mjolnir 3. I reviewed the Mjolnir 3 recently. It's a much cheaper amplifier, around about $1,200 US off the top of my head. And so it's way, way cheaper than the Voyager, and yet it went toe-to-toe with the Soloist 3X GT. Before I sent the Mjolnir on to the owner, I did have a chance to briefly compare it with the Voyager. And as you would expect, or at least hope, the Voyager does pull ahead pretty clearly, as it should, with the vast gulf in price. And specifically the areas that the Voyager was stronger is it just comes across more at ease across the board. It takes everything in its stride just a little bit more again than the already very kind of easygoing Mjolnir. And I don't mean easygoing in terms of slushy, I mean it's at ease with the music. Nothing seems too difficult, it's always under control. The Voyager just takes that to another level again. As a part of that, things like staging and imaging are a little bit stronger on the Voyager. Not a vast leap, but definitely enough that you can sort of hear why you might choose to pay more for the Voyager. And I also found that the bass from the Mjolnir 3 came across just a little bit less controlled. Now, I'm not saying that it actually is less controlled, but the sound of it, the way it's delivered and its character, it sounded a little bit more bloomy. I don't mean boomy, but bloomy in the sense that there was a little bit more kind of softness to the bass, a bit more sense of bloom is probably the best word for it. Whereas I felt like the Voyager kept it all really tightly under control, but with no loss of weight or authority as a result. Now, having said all this, it's not to say that the Mjolnir 3 didn't have a few tricks of its own, and I do think in some ways that there's a sense of naturalness to the Mjolnir's sound, a sense of transparency to it that in some ways might actually be better than the Voyager, but I think overall the Voyager's sense of maturity, refinement, resolution, and staging does pull ahead of the Mjolnir pretty clearly. And so the end result of my listening between the two was that I think the Voyager is clearly the better overall amplifier, but I also think that those with the Mjolnir 3 have an incredible bit of value on their hands because it does get so close to the Voyager for so much less. However, the Voyager is still the better amp, as it should be for the money, and so let's move now and put it up against an even better amp. Now, I know that a lot of you are hanging out to hear the Voyager versus the Soloist comparisons. I am getting there. The reason for keeping it to the end is there's lots of layers to that comparison, and so I want to do one more simple comparison first with the Enleum AMP-23R. For those not familiar with the Enleum AMP-23R, it's a much more expensive amplifier again. It comes in at around about $6,000, and it's both a headphone amp and a speaker amp. Listening to Galleon Ship by Nick Cave and the Bad Seeds through both of these, and again using the same source chain I mentioned before with things like the M Scaler and the TT2 feeding both of these amps, kicking off with the Enleum on that track, and it provides a wonderful sense of staging and imaging. All the sounds are separated really nicely around the soundstage, and there's a beautiful focus on Nick Cave's vocal. The electronic bass in this track, which is long, kind of drawn out notes, is controlled and it's solid from the Enleum. And there's a little bit of a touch of sizzle on the sibilance from Nick Cave's vocal. It's not harsh, it's not fatiguing, but the Enleum is letting me know that it's there. And so how I describe it is the Enleum's letting you know the character of the source chain and the track that you're listening to. Whether it's the headphones, the DAC, the recording, the combination of all of those, you are going to hear that through the Enleum for sure. As I then moved over to the Voyager, it kept almost everything that I've just said pretty much the same, but not quite. In some ways, I feel like the Soloist is not quite as transparent as the Enleum. It's like the Enleum just gets right out of the way, whereas it's almost like the Voyager is controlling things a little bit more, and you can hear that it's controlling things a bit more. Now, that results in a slightly better sense of refinement from the sound, and so it's not to say that one's better or worse, they're just a bit different. There are times that I find the Enleum is not as relaxing and easy to listen to, whereas the Voyager is always easy to listen to, but still gives you lots and lots of detail. I should also add that the Enleum is currently running with a couple of audiophile tweaks that I talked about last week in Tweak Week, that being an audiophile fuse and a Tellurium Q Black version 2 power cable, both of which in my listening test actually amped up the transparency further. So it means that you're spending more money to get that significant transparency from the Enleum, whereas at $4,199 you're getting exactly what I'm describing from the Voyager with no extra money spent. Not that you should have to spend more money, they're already very expensive amps. The point being, if I was to pull the Enleum back to a generic power cable and a generic power fuse, you'd probably find that things were a little bit closer. Now again, when we start talking about audiophile tweaks, A, some of you get really angry, and B, it's worth noting that the differences aren't drastic. It's not like it's transforming devices by changing the power cord. It can improve it, but not transform it. And so I did think about removing those tweaks and seeing how these compared, but the reality is they're both top-notch amplifiers already. And even with the tweaks applied to the Enleum, the Voyager's absolutely keeping up. They're neck and neck, and it comes down to a preference. Do you want that little bit of extra transparency and that sense of the amplifier kind of disappearing at the expense of a slightly less refined sound? Or do you want that refinement and that sense of ease and the ability to listen to anything and everything and enjoy it? That's where the Voyager is going to come into play. Now, to be clear, I mentioned the sibilants were obvious from the Enleum when they're in the chain and when they're in the recording. The same is true for the Voyager. The sibilants were a little bit easier to deal with from the Voyager, and again, they were very minor, so it's because I'm looking for these things that I'm talking about it. Neither amplifier was harsh, but it was even easier to enjoy from the Voyager, even though I was still very clear that those sibilants were there. I was hearing all of it. It was just delivered in a way that was a bit more pleasing. One other area that I felt there was a slight difference between these two was that I think the bass from the Voyager might be slightly more solid, slightly more weighty than the Enleum. It's a very subtle call, and it's one of those things that by the time I switched, I was hearing different bass notes as I switched between them. So it was very hard to get a direct, very fast A-B comparison, and they might be close enough as to be identical, but if there is an edge in one direction, the Voyager's got it. And so after doing this comparison, my conclusion is that both of these are absolute world-class headphone amps. You really can't go wrong. And I think how I'd split it is that if you don't need a speaker amp, I would buy the Voyager, not the Enleum. There's probably no point having the Voyager and the Enleum unless you've got lots and lots of money and you like having those slightly different characters. For example, with a headphone like the Focal Utopias, I probably enjoy the Voyager just a little bit more because of that extra sense of refinement. Whereas if I was to move over to something like the Mesa Elites that don't necessarily need that bit of smoothness, then I might give the edge to the Enleum. But the reality is, every single day that I sit at my desk while these amps are here, I sit down, I choose a headphone, and I don't think twice. I just plug it into whichever headphone amp I feel like plugging it into. Because it pairs, when I say it, the Voyager or the Enleum, they both pair with whatever you want to plug them into. And that's what's wonderful about them. And so for me, the Voyager at $4,199 is matching the $6,000 plus Enleum AMP-23R at an overall enjoyment level. They're just doing it a little bit differently. And so with all that said, and with that in mind, let's now turn our sights on the Soloist GT up against the Voyager and some different op-amp combinations as well. If you're not familiar with the range of the Burson amps, let me give you a really quick introduction here. What I've got sitting on top of the Voyager here is the Soloist 3 GT. This is the fully single-ended version of the Soloist GT. And then there's also connected over in my rack here, the Soloist 3X GT, which is the fully balanced version. Now, both of these run dual mono circuits. They all basically essentially run the same. They're the same chassis size. A lot of it's identical, and it's just then single-ended versus balanced. So I've got this one here more to show you the size and to give you a sense of what it looks like if you haven't seen these before. This is now the second from the top option, that being the 3GT and the 3X GT in the Soloist range, and the Soloist Voyager is now the top of the range. As you can probably see here, the footprint is exactly the same. So they take up the same sort of horizontal space on a desk, but with the new casing in the Voyager, and I'll come back around to the casing and the cooling and everything at the end, the new casing is taller, but otherwise exactly the same footprint. So that's why I have the Soloist GT sitting here, just to show you what exactly we're talking about in terms of differences. If we then think about what's going on inside the amplifiers though, we then have to start talking about the different variants of both these amps. As I said at the opening, the testing I've done is with the top of the range Soloist Voyager. That's the $4,199 version. And for that money, what you're getting installed inside the Voyager is a full set of the V7 Vivid. That's the top of the range, brand new op amp from Burson Audio. Whereas with the Soloist GT range, the GT range comes with the lower level V6 op amps, which at the time of their release was the top of the range. It's just now been superseded with the V7s. And the reason I'm specifying all this at the beginning is that you're spending $4,199 for a full spec Voyager, whereas if you were to buy yourself a 2023 Soloist 3X or 3GT, you'd be spending $2,799 to get the base model of the amp with the supercharger power supply, which is a high quality, sort of high speed power supply. You'd then have to add on $299 for the power control modules that upgrade this one to match the power control modules inside the Voyager. And then you'd also need to add a set of the V7 Vivid op amps to upgrade this from the V6 version. And that's going to be another $510, although at the time of me recording this and doing my notes on the 7th of March, the V7 Vivids and the V7 Classics are on sale for $430. But if we take it at the full retail of $510, that puts the Soloist GT fully upgraded to match everything possible about the Voyager other than the whole physical design. But in terms of having the SPO2 modules, the V7 Vivid op amps, and the 5 amp power supply, the supercharger, to do all of that, you're going to end up spending $3,608. And so as I said in the opening, there's a little bit more than $500 between a fully spec'd Soloist GT and a fully spec'd Soloist Voyager. And so the question for me was, how close can the best version of the Soloist GT as you can buy it off the shelf get? And then what happens if you start upgrading the op amps as well? And so I kicked things off by comparing the Voyager with the Soloist 3X GT, so the one that's in my rack still, the balanced one. I was comparing the Voyager with the Soloist 3X GT running the SPO2 power modules and the 5 amp supercharger. And so as I said just a minute ago, and I know there's a number of layers and complexities here, so sorry if this is confusing. What I started off comparing was the best version of the Soloist that you can buy without having to do any of the modifications yourself, and then comparing that to the best version of the Voyager you can buy without having to do any modifications yourself. One of the tracks I listened to for this test and made my notes on was Shadowboxer by Fiona Apple. On this track, the Soloist GT had a little bit more treble sizzle to me. And I use the word sizzle because it's got a little bit of extra energy or something in the treble. As I said earlier in this review, that's probably my one and only issue with the Soloist. And when I say issue, it's not even an issue. It's one of the things that comes up when you start comparing the Soloist with other amplifiers, is there's a certain character to the sound from the Soloist GT range. And it is to do with that little bit of sizzle. As I switch back and forth between the two, first of all, the Voyager doesn't have that sizzle. It's still got the treble detail, it's still fully extended, and there's lots of clarity there and lots of energy there, but it hasn't got the sizzle in the treble. And what it also has that the Soloist GT doesn't is it's got a greater sense of space and a better sense of image focus and separation because there's more space to work with. And the Soloist GT was never a slouch on soundstage presentation. The Voyager's just even better. You're getting more sense of depth and layering in the soundstage, and so comparatively, the Soloist GT suddenly starts to sound a bit flat and a bit left-right. And I've never said that about the Soloist GTs before, but the Voyager makes them sound a bit that way. One example of this is that there's some backing strings in the left channel of Shadowboxer by Fiona Apple, and on the Soloist GT, those backing strings were kind of a little bit forward in the mix. They were kind of pushed level with Fiona Apple's vocals. Whereas from the Voyager, they remained as a background instrumental. They were still off to the side, but they were just back a couple of steps, and it allowed the overall sense of coherency and naturalness of the soundstage to sound a lot more lifelike. And in fact, something that I wrote in my notes is that the Voyager comes across at the same time, and these things sound a bit contradictory at first, but it comes across sounding both better separated and more coherent. All the instruments are more pulled apart in the sense that you can very easily hear where they each are, you can hear the space around them, and yet somehow they all mesh together into a more cohesive single sonic picture, if you like. Now again, I can't stress enough, this is not making the Soloist GT range into junk. It's just showing that the Voyager is another step up again, and that's what you're going to be paying for. But of course, some of you might be sitting there with an existing Soloist GT, whether it's a 2023 version that can be upgraded or an older one that can't be upgraded in terms of the power supply modules. What you can do in any of them though is roll the op amps. So what I'm going to talk about next is how the Soloist 3X GT performed with the SPO2 modules and with the V7 Vivids. Could it get right up to the level of the Soloist Voyager, or is there something going on in the circuit of the Voyager that still separates it from a fully upgraded Soloist 3X GT? And listening to Kashmir by Jimmy Page and Robert Plant from the No Quarter album, the short answer is the Soloist GT can get very close, but the Voyager still has an edge. As I listened to this, what I started to notice was that the Voyager has a weightier sound to it across the board. So much so that I started wondering if the Voyager that had been sent by Burson, because it's a demo unit, I started to wonder if maybe they'd actually left the classics installed in there instead of the Vivids. For those not familiar, the Vivids are kind of the neutral, transparent and clean version of the op amp. The classics are a slightly deliberately rich, coloured, more analogue sort of sound you could say. And so I started to wonder, given that now the Vivids were in the Soloist 3X GT and it was not sounding as rich and warm as I was hearing from the Voyager, I thought maybe I'd mismatched the op amps. But I double checked and it is all the original stock V7 Vivids in the Voyager. They were still cable tied down. And so that's telling us straight away that there are differences in the output stage and the overall circuit of the Voyager that are leading to its different tonality over and above the op amps. And I'll talk a little bit more about that output stage at the end. In addition to that slightly weightier sound, and again, I don't mean it's a thick sound, it's just got weight, it's got authority and maturity, and actually probably a better tonal balance overall. And in addition to that, there's also still a certain depth in the soundstage from the Voyager that you can't quite match with the 3X GT. On top of that, the sound from the Voyager also comes across sounding just more effortless and easy. That comes back to that maturity that I spoke about before. It just sounds like such an in-control, perfectly at ease amplifier, rather than the GT is a little bit more high-strung, you could say. Again, we're talking very subtle differences here. I'm not knocking the GT, I can't stress that enough, but the Voyager's just constantly getting a little bit better in every possible category. A couple of other things that I noticed as I kept listening was that the sound of, say, a vocalist is a little bit closer to you from the soloist. So it's a slightly more intimate sound to start with, whereas the Voyager gives you a bit more space from the kind of front or the starting position of the music, as well as more depth. And then on top of that, sounds like, say, a cymbal can be a little bit splashy on the Soloist GT, whereas when you go to the Voyager, you still hear the natural sense of splashiness and shimmer from the Voyager. But as I've already said, it's just kind of controlled better. It's a bit more easy to listen to, a bit more natural, whatever you want to call it. All the details there, it's just not as enhanced as it can sometimes sound like from the GTs. And so at this point, the sense of ease, the sense of weight and authority I was getting from the Voyager, the fact that I'd wondered if it had the classics in it, that all led me to one more test. And that was to put the V7 Classics into the Soloist to see if the Classics with their slightly richer sound could offset the natural, slightly treble emphasized tonality of the GT and balance things out. And I have to say, I thoroughly enjoyed the Soloist 3X GT, this being the 2023 version with the SPO2 modules, running the V7 Classics. That's the best I think I've heard of GT. It is a thicker sound, and I'll explain exactly how thick compared to the Voyager in a second. It's definitely a thicker, richer sound, but it just works really nicely with the GT in my opinion. One of the tracks I listened to for this test was Hey Hey Hallelujah by Rachel Platten. Not a great recording, it's just a pop recording, but it still gave me some insight into the differences in these amps. And as I've said, with the Classics in the GT, it did become a richer, weightier, kind of mid-range focused amplifier in all the best possible ways. It's no doubt a coloured amplifier once you do that, so do be prepared for that if you go down that path, but it's coloured in the best possible way. It's so enjoyable, so kind of, as I said, weighty, meaty and mid-range focused. Interestingly, within that change, the Classics actually help to bring more sense of depth and space to the sound from the GT. And that's often not what we think of. When we go to a slightly richer sound, we think of things getting more congested often, but it's not the case with the V7 Classics. As I spoke about in my separate review of the op amps on their own, the V7 Classics actually produce a greater sense of space than the V7 Vivids do, and that plays really well in the Soloist GT. It's also important to note that the V7 Classics don't muddy things up. You don't lose detail and transparency. It's just a different character to the sound, not a loss of anything in the sound. Having said that though, the Voyager is still clearly ahead on resolution, clarity, overall sense of space and imaging and separation. It still comes out ahead. And so the long and the short of it is, the upgrades to the Voyager design from an internal circuitry point of view are paying off over and above what the op amps themselves can do. You can never get, sorry to say this to GT owners, you can never get your GT to the level of the Voyager. It's not possible with op amps and power supply modules and stuff like that. It's a complete change in the output circuit design that Burson have made with the Voyager. And so what you can do is get your GT sounding wonderful and really, really good, but you're never quite going to get it to the level of the Voyager no matter what you do. Now, it's worth noting at this point that you can buy the Voyager with the V6 Vivid, so that being the previous top-of-the-line V6 op amps in the Voyager. That's going to cost you a bit less money. It's a good way to get into the world of the Voyager if you can't spend the full $4,199 up front. But because I didn't want this video to drag out for too long and I didn't want to complicate things too much, I haven't tested the Voyager with the V6 Vivids in it. And there's two reasons for that. One of them is, as I said, I didn't want to make the video longer. The other thing is, the reality, you're going to end up buying the V7 Vivids anyway. We all know that. So I haven't tested the V6 Vivids in the Voyager. I am very comfortable and confident now that the character of the Voyager is such that it is going to be better. The Voyager with the V6 Vivids is still going to be better than the Soloist with the V6 Vivids, the same op amps in other words. And so if that's a starting point that you want to take, it's an absolutely valid and positive one. You can always upgrade, and the reality, as I just said, is that you probably will upgrade to the V7 Vivids down the track. But what the Voyager is giving you as a starting foundation is stronger and more capable than what the Soloist GT is, even though the Soloist GT is already a top-level, world-class headphone amp. And so with all that covered off, let's talk now about the design of the Voyager, both inside and out. What's different, what's new, what's changed, the things I like and don't like about the Voyager. We might kick things off with a look at the outside and then talk about what's going on the inside. And on the outside, things are very, very similar to the old Soloist GT range in the sense that you've still got the power button on the side. You've then got a 3.5mm headphone jack that's for using with headsets. That's going to pass the microphone signal straight through to the back of the headphone amp to go out to an audio interface, a sound card, whatever it might be that you need to connect it to for your comms. And then next to that, we've got a 6.3mm jack and a 4-pin XLR socket. Underneath the screen in the middle, we've got the same buttons as we used to for input, output, the menu access, and also to change the orientation of the screen if you want to run this in a vertical orientation. We've then got over on the side a volume control that's also clickable to select options in the menu. And then coming back around to the display, Burson have gone for a new look display here, and it's using this bright kind of greeny aquary colour. At first glance, I didn't think I liked it as much as the old white on the Soloist GT range. But as I spent more time with it, it's really grown on me, and the reason for that is that even at its lowest setting, it's much easier to read. It kind of is a little bit brighter overall, and the reason I'm talking about the lowest setting, with the original GT range, and I haven't ever tested this on the 2023 version, but with the original GT range, having the OLED display up too high could actually bring some noise into the audio circuit if you're using very sensitive headphones or IEMS. Only the most sensitive, but it was there. And so I like the fact that you can have the OLED display on the Voyager at its very lowest setting and also still see it really clearly. So I do like that about it. For those of you that like a really dim display, it doesn't get as dim as the OLEDs on the GTs do. So that might be an issue for you if you like listening in a dark room, but I also don't find this too bright in a darkened room either. Now, for those not familiar with the Soloist GT and Voyager range, what is within the menu system are all sorts of things like obviously your input, your output. You can tell it whether you want the remote control to be active or not active. That can be helpful if you don't need the remote control and you've got other remote controls that you're using in the area. You don't want that to trigger this one with their commands. I've had that happen a few times. You can also have crossfeed with the Voyager. I'm not generally a huge fan of crossfeed, so I haven't tested this out in depth, but the feature's there if you want it. There's 3 different levels. You've got an auto off feature, which is great. That's going to switch the amplifier off if there's been no signal for a while. And then there's also a balance control as well for those that need it either for preamp use if you're sending this out to speakers, or if you need it for, say, unilateral hearing loss with headphone listening. And then speaking of headphone listening, something else that the Burson range, the GTs and the Voyager do is they don't just give you headphone outputs, they also give you subwoofer outputs that work with headphones. And so the whole idea of this is if you've got a pair of ear speakers or a pair of open back headphones and you're in a position where you could listen to it with a subwoofer for extra bass reinforcement, then the Voyager still has that feature, and I know some people use it and really like it. So that's still there. In addition to that, as we've had in the past from the GT range, we've got 2 pairs of XLR inputs and RCA inputs, so a total of 4 different inputs. And those are separated. This is worth being aware of, particularly if you've got, say, an RCA cable that is combined and just has a short split at the end. These are separated across the width of the amplifier. So you've got your right input 1 is all the way on one side. Your left input of that same channel 1 is all the way on the other side. That's been done because this is a fully, as far as I know, fully symmetrical dual mono design. And so the whole idea there is it's giving you maximum channel separation. It is an issue for some people depending on your interconnects. For me, I love it. I think it's great. So you've got 4 different inputs. You've then got preamp outputs, both XLR and RCA, and a single RCA in the center there, which is your subwoofer output. And so this can run as a pure headphone amp, as a preamp, and then also as a headphone amp with a subwoofer pre-out. Now there is no distinct subwoofer control here, so any of your crossovers, your levels, that's all being done on the subwoofer itself. The final thing that I should point out while we're here, other than obviously you've got your power input for your supercharger power supply or your regular wall wart, or actually it's an inline power brick style supply, that's over there. And then the other things to point out, just like the GT range, we've got 12 volt trigger outputs. So if you're running these with, say, Timekeeper GTs, you can have the Timekeeper switch on whenever the Voyager switches on. That's just the same as the GT range. And of course that will work with any amplifier that uses 12 volt triggers, or DAC for that matter. Some DACs have it. That can then trigger this to switch on, and then this can trigger your downstream power amplifiers to switch on. That's all possible there. And then underneath, this is the key difference. Underneath here, this is the thing that separates it from the Soloist GT range, are these copper-coloured heat sinks. And what these are is the new cooling system in the Voyager range. Because if you look at the old Soloist GT, the Soloist GT had this fan in the top. And this was a contentious issue for some people. It's been made as quiet as Burson could make it, but it's still a fan. And so you can still hear the fan particularly if you haven't got music playing at the time, or it's a very quiet passage. If you're sitting close to the amplifier, you can hear the fan, and that was an issue for some people. And so what's happened with the new Voyager is that Burson have designed a system that does still use a fan, or maybe it's even fans. I've not looked because it's hidden, buried underneath the PCB. Underneath the PCB is a fan that is taking the hot air out of the chassis area and pumping it out through the back through these heat sinks. And that means a couple of things. Firstly, it means that this is as good as silent. I did a test in the live stream where I actually held this up to the microphone. You can almost not hear the fans in the Voyager, even when you put your ear right next to those output vents. So it's as good as silent in my opinion. It's not worth even thinking about the fact there's fans in there, to the point that I actually had to double check with Burson to make sure I wasn't hearing things. Whereas with the GT range, you know straight away there's a fan there. It's pretty quiet, I don't mind it, but this is definitely better. What that also means though is that it does get hotter. And the air pumping out through these vents here is also quite hot. So depending on where you're putting it, you do need to be a little bit aware of having some ventilation behind the amplifier and probably just generally above and around it as well. I've had absolutely no issues with this in terms of heat. It gets quite warm to the touch, but it's not dangerous or going to burn you. But I just thought it was worth mentioning the differences and the changes in the cooling system. And one of the questions that came up when I first did the live stream with the pre-production version of the Voyager, one of the questions came up is, why does Burson even need a fan in there when other companies are producing powerful amps with no fans? And I reached out to Burson and they provided an answer. And that is that the design of the Soloist GT and now the Voyager, they're using a very high idling current. As I understand it, the idea behind using high idling current is about minimizing distortion and keeping the transistors within the amplifier operating in their optimal range. Now, of course, the pros and cons of this depend a lot on the design of the circuit, and that's beyond my understanding of the electronics. But that's the reason that Burson do it, and according to Burson, it's also the reason that they're able to get the sound quality and the power output levels that they get from the Soloist range, both the GT and the Voyager. And so that's the reason they run hot, it's the reason they still need fans, and in my opinion, they've managed to pull off the perfect version of it here in terms of the quality of the sound they're getting, whilst also minimizing any sense of fan noise and keeping the device cool and compact. Now, one other thing to note about the physical design of it is it is now a taller amplifier as well, I mentioned that earlier. And that means if you've got one of the very original Burson motherships, or if you're running a GT in a space that it kind of only just fits, you might have some trouble with the Voyager. Of course, there's measurements on the website. You can go and check out the exact dimensions if you're trying to find out how to fit it into your current setup. But if you do have one of the old original Burson mothership stands, I believe they changed it pretty early in its lifespan, then it might be worth reaching out to Burson and just double checking if this one's going to fit or if you need the new one, or just doing some measurements yourself, of course. And so that covers off the external design, the ins, the outs, the menu, etc. Let's now talk about one last thing, and that's what's going on the inside. So I've already mentioned the fact that this is now a new circuit design compared to the GT. Obviously, it's an evolution of it. It's not going to be a brand new design necessarily, but it's definitely an evolution. And not just in terms of putting the fan underneath and the new cooling system. Burson have also explained that they've used a new output stage here, and the design of the output stage that's obviously picking up on the use of the new V7 op amps if you buy it at the maximum level version. The design of that output stage is such that it's intended to better control the movement of the driver, the characteristics of the driver, essentially interact with the driver better and control it better, particularly for drivers with variable impedance. So any dynamic driver headphones with wild swings of impedance, or indeed if you're using a bunch of different planar magnetic headphones with all different impedances, any particular headphone at any impedance that you want to plug into the Voyager, the point is it's going to control that particular headphone exactly the same as any other. It's not varying from one to another in terms of how the output stage is able to control and interact with that driver. This is not about output impedance. The Soloist GT and the Soloist Voyager both have the same output impedance of about 0.5 ohms. So it's not about the old version having high output impedance, the new version having low output impedance. This is about how the output stage responds and reacts to the different impedances. And so that to me is the answer for why the Voyager is consistently sounding better than even a fully upgraded with the V7 Vivid op amp Soloist GT, is because that output stage is even better. And that's why I said before, if you were to buy yourself a Voyager with the V6 Vivids, I still believe it's going to sound better than a Soloist GT with the same V6 Vivids. It's a better, more mature and more refined circuit, and that's saying something because the GTs were already so good. And so the final thing to point out, because some of you might not be aware, what we've got going on inside here is we've got these little chips here that you can probably see. These are the SpO2 power modules. So these are the bits that you can upgrade in the case of the Soloist GT. They come standard in the case of the Voyager. And then these little red things here, these are all the V7 Vivid op amps. And so if you buy the base version Voyager, you'll get the red plastic version V6 Vivid. If you buy the premium version Voyager, that's where you get the little anodized red aluminium V7 Vivids. And so I think that's all I can really tell you about the Burson Voyager at this point. The short summary of it is it's a magnificent headphone amplifier. It's incredibly enjoyable with everything you can think to plug into it. I didn't mention before, there's also 3 gain levels on the Voyager. And that's brilliant because it means that whether you're running sensitive IEMs all the way through to really difficult, say, planar magnetic headphones, you can absolutely get the volume range you need with the 3 different gain levels available. So that's really important too. And that goes back to my summary that I was just making, which is with every single headphone or IEM that I've thrown at this, it takes it all completely in its stride. Its character, its delivery, and its sound quality is the same no matter what you plug into it. And so what that means for us is that no matter what headphone or headphones you have, no matter what source chain you have, and basically no matter what you're listening to, the Burson Soloist Voyager is an absolute beast of an amplifier. I'm not going to sit here and suggest that it's better than options like the Enleum, the HM1, some of the other really premium amps out there, but it's absolutely in the same ballpark in the sense that if you were to choose this over the others, you're getting pros and cons in both directions. There are things that the Voyager does that others don't do as well, and then if you're playing at the same level, there's things that other amplifiers do that the Voyager doesn't do as well, but you're not going to be disappointed, I think, with the Voyager ever. I can understand some people who've bought the Soloist GT in the past and been a little bit disappointed with that because of the timbre qualities. I can't see anybody having that issue with the Soloist Voyager. And in fact, if there was one area that I think some people might dislike it for, it's that it might be a little bit too refined. As I said earlier, it's not quite as completely transparent as something like the Enleum is. But on the other hand, as I also said before, that makes it more enjoyable across more headphones, more IEMs, more source chains, and more tracks. And so that's where I'm getting at this sense of trade-off where each headphone amp at this kind of level has its own benefits, its own features, its own strengths, and its own weaknesses. I don't think there's any perfect product on the planet when it comes to music reproduction because nothing's ever going to quite match the real thing as in a live performance. And so with all that said, I think the Voyager is an absolutely amazing amp. It's also an expensive amp, I get that. It's not going to be something that everybody can afford, and thankfully, the Soloist 3X GT range, with its upgradability, with the SpO2 power modules, and the various op amps, those still remain, and they're still brilliant, brilliant amplifiers. And so I want to say a huge thanks to Burson for giving me a chance to try the full production version of the Voyager. I think it's absolutely astounding. I love its design, I love its sound, I love the feature set, I just love the whole headphone amplifier. And therefore, if you're in the market for a headphone amp, you're looking for an absolute top-of-the-range, endgame type amp, and you've got this sort of money to spend, then you should absolutely check out the Burson Soloist Voyager. And by the way, I should mention, I have no affiliation with Burson. I get no kickbacks. I get no income if you buy from them. This is just an opportunity to share with you a product that I think is wonderful. So thanks again to Burson. Thanks to you for watching and taking in all this information. I know there was quite a lot to cover. And on that note, I hope you found the video useful and helpful. If you have, please hit the like button and subscribe and ring the notification bell if you haven't already. For now though, let me leave it to the music, so happy listening, be kind to each other, and I'll see you here next time on Passion for Sound.